It was on one of those grey-skied February mornings, when the fog hangs low over Baker Street like a woolen shroud and the rattle of hooves echoes through half-empty thoroughfares, that I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself once more roused by the agitated energies of my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He had been at his violin since before dawn, plucking with irregular intervals at dissonant strings, while pacing with such intensity that I feared for the safety of the Persian slipper which served as his tobacco pouch and had already been kicked beneath the hearthrug twice in his fits of restless thought. "You are unusually active this morning, Holmes," I ventured from behind the Times, trying to ignore the sharp note that rang out with an almost deliberate spite. "There has been no challenge in 3 weeks, Watson," he said with a tinge of something between boredom and hunger. 3 weeks of petty inquiries, of lost dogs and stolen lockets. I begin to fear that crime itself has grown tired. No sooner had he spoken than Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing not breakfast as I had hoped, but a pale envelope upon a silver tray. "It's marked urgent," she said. "Hand-delivered by a boy in a navy livery. Wouldn't give his name." Holmes snatched it with a flick of his long fingers. I saw his eyes sharpen as they scanned the seal, crimson wax with the impression of a Roman centurion's profile. Without another word, he broke it open. As he read, his entire demeanor shifted. The slight hunch of ennui vanished. His body became still. Only the pupils of his eyes moved, scanning, digesting, computing. "Well?" I pressed. He folded the letter slowly and held it up. "This, Watson, is the cry we have been waiting for. A murder most curious, and the client is none other than Sir Alpheus Branksome of Sussex." "The antiquarian?" I asked, recognizing the name. "Indeed. A scholar, collector of early medieval artifacts, and recluse. Given to hyperbole, which makes this all the more intriguing." Holmes stood, reached for his coat, and turned his sharp gaze to me. "He claims that a man has been killed within a locked room, a study surrounded by stone walls and a single, barred window that, by his own assertion, and has not been opened in 27 years. "Locked from the inside?" I asked, rising now with growing interest. "Precisely, and the only witness to the event," Holmes added, "claims to have seen it not in real time but reflected in the glass of that very window. A window that looks not onto the present, but into the past." I paused with my boot halfway to my foot. "You cannot be serious." Holmes smiled thinly. "You may pack your revolver if it comforts you, Watson, but I suspect what we shall require more is a clear eye, a steady hand, and a mind for impossibilities." Within the hour, we were aboard the London and Brighton Railway, Holmes with the letter folded neatly in his pocket, and I with my medical bag and notebook. As the train pulled us south through thickening mist and clusters of stark winter trees, I found myself reflecting on the words in the letter. The man is dead. The room was sealed. Yet I swear, as a man of reason and the Royal Society, I saw the murder reflected as if on a film of silver, through a window long disused. "I beg you, Mr. Holmes, come at once. Either I am going mad, or we are in the presence of something that defies the very principles of time." Sir Alpheus Branksome Holmes tapped the letter idly with a slender finger. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is no such thing as the supernatural, only the poorly understood." As we hurtled toward Sussex, I could not help but wonder, was this to be another case of clever human trickery dressed in cloak and dagger theatrics? Or were we stepping into something that neither logic nor lantern could easily illuminate? Either way, the game, as ever, was afoot. The station at Lewes lay draped in fog when we disembarked, the cold air carrying the faint scent of damp moss and coal smoke. A brougham awaited us, bearing a crest identical to the seal on Sir Alpheus Branksome's letter, a crimson centurion stamped upon the door. A stooped coachman in a wool cloak offered a silent nod as we entered, and moments later we were winding through Sussex lanes, flanked on either side by leafless hedgerows and the brooding silhouettes of ancient yews. Holmes remained unusually silent during the journey, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled just below his chin. I knew better than to interrupt such moments of introspection. Instead, I turned my thoughts to Sir Alpheus Branksome. Though I knew of him only in passing, a frequent contributor to scholarly periodicals on archaeology and esoterica, he had a reputation for precision, if not eccentricity. The idea that such a man would speak of visions in reflective glass suggested either an extraordinary deception or the kind of mental unraveling that even science dared not name. After nearly an hour, the brougham passed through wrought-iron gates and began the incline up to Branksome Hall. The structure was a half-Gothic, half-Romanesque monstrosity built from dark Purbeck stone, its turrets squatting beneath the low sky like the knees of some petrified beast. Ivy clung to the walls in wild tangles. And the windows, those few not shuttered, glinted with an odd luminescence that I attributed to the morning mist. We were greeted at the door not by a servant, but by the man himself. Sir Alpheus was tall, silver-haired, and severe in bearing. His expression bore the fatigue of sleepless nights, though his eyes, grey and restless, betrayed a mind still sharply focused. He wore a deep green velvet dressing gown over a pressed shirt and cravat, and his voice, when he spoke, had the clarity of a university lecturer. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, my sincerest thanks. You are most welcome, though I would not wish this madness upon any guest." Holmes inclined his head courteously. "We are most interested in what you wrote, Sir Alpheus. I would ask, if you are willing, to take us at once to the scene." He nodded. "Of course, you must see it for yourself before you begin to think me deranged." We followed him through a corridor dimly lit by wall sconces, lined with tapestries and vitrines of ancient objects, swords, shards of pottery, the skulls of long-dead animals. The house had the atmosphere of a tomb curated by a man with one foot in the past. We ascended a narrow staircase to the second floor, and from there to a wing that appeared even older than the rest of the structure. The air grew colder, and a musty odor clung to the stones. At last, Sir Alpheus stopped before a thick oak door banded with iron. "This is the west study," he said. "The room has been sealed officially since the constable came yesterday, but I've the key. The body has not been moved." Holmes nodded. "And the window?" "You will see," said Branksome grimly. He unlocked the door with a ceremonial slowness and stepped back. Holmes entered first, and I followed. The study was long and narrow, with shelves lining the far wall, heavy with manuscripts and catalogued specimens. A large oak desk stood near the center, cluttered with papers, a magnifying loupe, and several books, one of which was open to a page displaying a medieval illumination. And there, slumped across the carpet before the hearth, lay a man in a crumpled dark suit. His face was turned away, but I noted a blot of dried blood on the nape of his neck, just beneath the hairline. "A fatal blow from behind," I murmured. "Blunt force trauma." Holmes was already circling the room. He crouched beside the body, examining not only the wound, but the man's shoes, the position of the hands, the stiffness in the limbs. Then he moved on to the desk, lifting each item with care and glancing toward the fireplace, the mantel, and the soot around the grate. Only after 10 full minutes of such silent study did he turn to the far wall and the window. It was a narrow, high-set aperture, no more than 3 feet across, and barred with thick, rusted iron rods. The glass was leaded and rippled with age, and its sill was caked in the dust of decades. No hinges, no locks. Even the ironwork had calcified into the stone. Holmes stepped close and tilted his head. "You say this window has not been opened in 27 years?" "Longer," said Sir Alpheus. "That room was once part of the original monastery cloister. The builders sealed the window when the house was expanded. The bars were added sometime in the late 18th century to deter thieves." "And yet," said Holmes, tapping the sill with a knuckle, You saw the murder? Through here? Sir Alpheus inhaled deeply. I awoke at precisely 2:40 yesterday morning, unable to sleep. I took my lamp and began walking the halls, as I often do. When I passed this room, I stopped as I always do. And then I saw it, reflected in the glass. He gestured at the window, not a reflection of myself or the corridor behind me, but a scene within this room. The fire was lit. That man, the one you see there, was standing at the desk, leafing through the book. Behind him, a figure emerged from the shadows. He raised something, a stone carving, I think, and struck the man down. And then the fire went out. The room went black, and I saw nothing more. Holmes was staring at the glass now, nose inches from the warped surface. He withdrew a magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the lead lining. "There is no sign," he said quietly, "that this window has been tampered with." "It hasn't," said Branksome. "I would swear it on my life." Holmes turned away and motioned to me. "Watson, examine the body. Determine time of death if you can. I should like to see how it compares with Sir Alpheus's vision." I knelt beside the corpse and performed a swift but thorough examination. The temperature of the skin, the rigor mortis, the dried blood. I would place time of death between 2:30 and 3 a.m. yesterday. Sir Alpheus's account aligns with it precisely. Holmes nodded, seemingly unsurprised. He had returned to the hearth and now examined the andirons, brushing something into an envelope with his gloved hand. "Who was the deceased?" he asked. "Professor Eli Garrison," said Branksome, "an American scholar visiting me these last 3 weeks. He was assisting me with the translation of a 12th century treatise on pre-Christian iconography in Anglo-Saxon England. Brilliant fellow, but reserved, and lately tense, nervous. I assumed it was due to overwork." Holmes glanced toward the desk. "This book here, is it the one he was translating?" "Yes. Open to the folio on the Green Man." Holmes raised a brow. "The forest deity. Half forgotten, half demonized by the early church. Associated with renewal, death, and, if I recall, visions." Branksome's face paled slightly. "Are you suggesting?" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "I suggest nothing yet, only that we entertain all avenues." He straightened and looked once more at the barred window. "A locked room, a scholar dead by a blow no one heard, and a window that shows more than it should," he said softly. "Yes, Watson. This case promises to be most stimulating." He turned sharply to Sir Alpheus. "One final question. Has anyone at all left the estate since the body was found?" Branksome's jaw tightened. "Only one, Miss Lydia Garrison, the professor's niece. She left that very morning, after I explained what I had seen." "Where did she go?" "To the rectory in East Dean, to stay with Reverend Pell." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Very good. Watson, we shall visit the young lady. But first, let us speak with the constable, who was first on the scene." As we followed Branksome from the room, Holmes paused once at the threshold, casting a glance over his shoulder at the warped glass. "I suspect," he murmured, "that window will show us more than one murder before this case is through." As we descended the stone stairwell from the west study, I remained preoccupied with the sheer impossibility of the scene we had just examined. Holmes walked a few paces ahead, his stride unhurried but purposeful, eyes lowered, as though reviewing an invisible ledger in his mind. At the base of the staircase, Sir Alpheus paused beside a narrow archway and beckoned to a footman waiting there, young, fair-haired, with a complexion more pale than proper for his age. "Fetch Constable Merrow," Branksome instructed. "He's speaking with Mrs. Hensley in the kitchen. Tell him, Mr. Holmes wishes to see him in the study below the library." The servant departed at once, footsteps echoing away into the flagstone corridor. "Mrs. Hensley?" I inquired, glancing to Sir Alpheus. "Our housekeeper. She was the one who discovered the door ajar in the morning. The body was already cold. Naturally, I sealed the room again before the constable arrived. "Did she speak with the professor the previous evening?" asked Holmes. Sir Alpheus shook his head. "No. He kept to himself after supper. He was fond of retiring to the study late at night. That was his habit." Holmes offered no reply, merely nodded, and led us into a smaller study lit by a high, mullioned window. The space was lined with shelves bearing books on anthropology, language, and comparative myth, and the center was occupied by a circular table topped with a faded map of Saxon Britain. Holmes moved slowly around the room, allowing silence to build. When the constable arrived, Holmes greeted him with a brief lift of his chin. Constable Merrow was a thick-set man with bristled mutton chops and the kind of slow, deliberate speech that concealed a quick, if unpolished, intellect. He removed his cap respectfully but wasted no time with ceremony. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor, I've read about you both. Strange affair. This, no sign of forced entry, no weapon left behind, and the witness says he saw it all through a window that hasn't opened since Queen Victoria's wedding." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Walk us through your first impressions, if you please." "Well," said Merrow, settling into a low-backed chair, "I arrived around 9:15 yesterday morning. Sir Alpheus led me straight up. The room was just as you saw it. The man was laid out, dead for hours, and the only entrance was that one door. No keyhole scratches, no broken glass. I had the maid try the window latch just to be sure. Solid as stone. It didn't so much as creak." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "And the young lady, Miss Lydia Garrison? You spoke to her?" "Aye. She was pale as paper but composed, said she'd heard nothing during the night. Claimed her uncle had been agitated for days, muttering to himself, writing obsessively in some leather-bound journal. She said she feared for his health, but he refused to see a physician. She seemed frightened, but not surprised." "Frightened of what?" I asked. Merrow shrugged, didn't say. But her hands were trembling, and her bags were already packed when I asked where she was headed. "Left the house before noon." Holmes nodded, as if confirming something unsaid. "Was the journal recovered?" "No, sir. That's the odd bit. I searched his personal desk drawers. Nothing. Not even a scrap. I suppose he might have hidden it, but we've yet to find a single page in the house." Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. He stepped to the map at the center of the room and placed a finger along the Sussex coastline. "You're familiar with East Dean?" "Certainly. 20 minutes south by horse. Reverend Pell's rectory is just along the chapel road." Holmes turned. "I'd like you to send a message to the rectory. Ask Miss Garrison if she would return here for further questioning. Cordially, of course, but with emphasis on urgency. She may be withholding something vital." Merrow gave a crisp nod and departed. When we were alone once more, Holmes moved to the bookshelf and drew out a volume on English burial rites. He didn't open it, merely examined the spine and returned it. "The nature of Garrison's death," he said, "suggests planning. Not violence born of passion. A precise blow, delivered in silence, and no panic to follow, no ransacking, no mess." "A professional killer?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not necessarily, but someone who either knew how to kill cleanly or believed themselves invisible." I gave him a long look. "You mean someone who believed the crime would never be discovered?" "Precisely." I frowned. "And what do you make of the vision in the window?" Holmes's lips pressed into a tight line. "I make of it this, that we are dealing with a murderer clever enough to frame the impossible, and a witness perceptive enough to describe the illusion accurately." Before I could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. It was the footman again. "Telegram for Sir Alpheus. Arrived at the gate a moment ago." Branksome received the paper with curiosity, tore it open, and as his eyes skimmed its contents, he blanched. "Well?" Holmes prompted. The old scholar looked up. "It's from the British Museum." A courier was due to arrive next week with an artifact we'd requested, one that Professor Garrison had studied. They've just discovered it missing. Missing? Yes, a fragment of the Templewell mirror. I turned sharply. The what? A relic, unearthed in Lincolnshire, Branksome said. Bronze, Roman Celtic origin, allegedly belonged to a seeress of some forgotten cult. Garrison had been obsessed with. It claimed the inscriptions along its edge matched passages from the texts he was translating. He said it was a key. A key to what? I asked. But Holmes was already striding to the hall. To understanding motive, Watson. Come, we must return to the study. If the professor was murdered for something he took, the killer may have left a trace behind. This time, Holmes brought out his lens, examining the shelves and desk with heightened scrutiny. I moved to the hearth and examined the scorched fragments Holmes had collected earlier. Amid the blackened debris, I found something odd, half a strap of cracked leather, not from a shoe or satchel, but a journal binding. The edge was charred, but the stitching remained intact. Holmes, I said, holding it up. This might be the missing journal. He took it, eyes brightening with interest. Excellent, Watson. And here, look. He turned the fragment over and pointed to a faint marking, a circle within a triangle, embossed into the leather. I frowned. What is that? A seal, he said. I've seen it once before on a manuscript in Berlin. It belonged to a society called Ordo Viatorum Temporis, the Order of the Watchers of Time. I stared at him. You think Garrison was a member? I think he was chasing something more than academic theory, and it may have cost him his life. He returned to the window, once more studying the ripple of the glass. The fog outside had thickened, but a faint shimmer remained where the light hit it. Watson, he murmured. This window shows only what we wish to see until we learn how it was used against us. As he spoke, a shadow passed beyond the hallway door. The footman reappeared, breathless. Mr. Holmes, Miss Garrison has returned. She's waiting in the drawing room, but she seems frightened. She says someone followed her carriage through the woods. Holmes looked at me without a word, then swiftly exited. I followed, heart quickening. The fog outside thickened still, pressing against the walls of Branksome Hall like a curtain waiting to fall. And I knew, with dreadful certainty, that the window into the past might yet offer a vision of what was to come. The drawing room into which we were ushered bore little of the gloom that had clung to the rest of Branksome Hall. A fire crackled in the hearth, shedding a soft amber glow across dark mahogany paneling and well-worn armchairs. The curtains were drawn, muffling the wan light of the fog-enshrouded afternoon. Seated nearest the fire, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap, was Miss Lydia Garrison. She was a woman of perhaps 27, pale of complexion, with intelligent, alert eyes and auburn hair gathered severely at the nape. Her clothing, modest and impeccably neat, bore the creases of recent travel. She looked up as we entered, her eyes darting from Holmes to me and then settling again on the flames as though afraid to speak until addressed. Holmes approached slowly, offering a slight bow. Miss Garrison, I am Sherlock Holmes. You know of me, I presume? I do, she said in a voice that was composed but edged with unease. My uncle spoke of you once, when discussing a theft at the Bodleian Library. He admired your methods. Then you know I am not here to indulge fancies, Miss Garrison. I am here because your uncle is dead, under circumstances that defy conventional explanation, and you were among the last to see him alive. She met his gaze now, her spine stiffening slightly. Yes, she said, but I saw nothing, heard nothing, and I am not convinced anyone else did either. Then, let us speak plainly, Holmes said, settling into a chair opposite hers. Your uncle was seen in the West Study at precisely 2:40 a.m., struck down by a figure emerging from the shadows. The man who claims to have seen this swears the vision came not through a door, nor through human witnessing, but via reflection in a sealed and ancient window. Lydia's expression did not change. Yes, Sir Alpheus told me this. I do not doubt what he believes he saw, but I do not believe in visions. Nor do I, said Holmes. What I believe in is reason, which is why I must ask you, did your uncle ever speak to you of the Templewell mirror? At that, a flicker of something crossed her features, a tightening around the eyes, the faintest pull at the corner of her mouth. Yes, she said, after a pause. He called it a lens, not a mirror. A key, he said, to a form of perception that had been lost deliberately, perhaps by the early church. He was obsessed with it. He said the window in the west study was once part of the same sacred geometry. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did he ever show you the journal in which he recorded his studies? She shook her head. He guarded it fiercely. Once, I tried to touch it and he shouted at me. Apologized moments later, of course, but it was the first time I'd seen him lose control. He was afraid of what he'd written, I think. Afraid? I asked, surprised. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. There were nights I would pass his door and hear him speaking to someone, but always alone. At least alone in the room. And then one morning, I found pages burned in the fireplace. Torn fragments, symbols drawn in ink, repeated phrases. The past is not behind, it is beneath. I thought he'd fallen into some fever of the mind. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Tell me, Miss Garrison, he said, rising and beginning a slow circle around the room. He called it the Watchers. He said they kept secrets too large for daylight. He claimed that if the mirror fell into the wrong hands, it could be misused not to see the past, but to rewrite it. Holmes stopped behind her, his tone softening. And is that why you left yesterday morning? Because you feared someone else might already have those hands upon it? She turned in her chair to look up at him. I left because someone tried to open the door to my room. Twice. At precisely the same hour, my uncle died. A hush followed this. Holmes resumed his pacing. Were you able to see who it was? No. The lock held, but I heard retreating footsteps, soft, deliberate, not like a servant. I told Sir Alpheus I was going to the rectory for rest, but the truth is I feared the house. Not just what it held, but what it remembered. Remembered? I asked. She turned to me, her eyes somber. My uncle used to say that old houses, like old mines, forget nothing. They only wait for someone foolish enough to listen. There was silence for a long moment. Holmes studied her, then glanced at the fire. I have no further questions for now, Miss Garrison. You have been admirably forthright. I suggest you remain within the house. Do not wander after dark. And if you hear those footsteps again, bolt your door and call for Watson or myself immediately. As we withdrew, Holmes said nothing until we had returned to the corridor and begun our descent toward the west wing again. I noticed he quickened his pace slightly and kept his hands tucked behind his back. You believe her, I said. I believe she believes herself, Holmes replied, and that is sufficient for now. But the claim someone attempting her door, could that have been a servant? Perhaps, but unlikely. The true question is, if someone did try to harm her, why stop? Why flee? Guilt? Cowardice? Or were they startled away by something else? By what? He stopped. Facing a window that looked out into the thick fog surrounding the side gardens, his reflection ghosted faintly on the glass. Perhaps, he murmured, by a glimpse of themselves in a window that should not have reflected anything at all. We were interrupted by the return of Constable Merrow, who emerged from a lower hallway bearing a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Found this in the servants' stairwell, he said, hidden behind a loose stone. One of the groundsmen spotted something glinting when he went out for coal. Holmes opened the parcel swiftly. Inside was a shard of what appeared at first glance to be bronze, but when turned toward the light, shimmered with an unnatural sheen, not unlike mercury beneath glass. Fragment of the mirror? I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. Unquestionably, And it confirms what I feared. The relic was not simply stolen, it was broken. He held it higher, inspecting the pattern etched into its curved concentric rings surrounding a trio of interlocked triangles. Worse still, he added. Someone went to considerable lengths to hide this piece, but not discard it, which means they intend to return. I looked at him. To what purpose? Holmes lowered the fragment. To complete what they began, but not, I think, in the way we expect. The shadows stretched long down the hall behind us. Somewhere in the house, a clock began to chime the hour. Holmes straightened and handed the parcel to Merrow. Secure this in your evidence locker. I want it guarded. And us? I asked. We, Holmes said, already moving toward the stair, are going to speak with the local rector. If Reverend Pell is truly hosting Miss Garrison, he may know more than he realizes, especially if her uncle's last confidences were of a theological or heretical nature. As we reached the entryway and donned our coats once more, Holmes turned to me and said in a low voice meant for no other ears, "The dead man may have studied the past, Watson. But someone here believes it can be altered, and I fear they are about to try." The fog had not lifted when we set out for the rectory, but rather had thickened into a muffling veil through which even the gas lamps of Branksome Hall seemed to flicker as though underwater. The hired trap Holmes had requested was waiting at the gates, its driver hunched in a worn oilskin, reins slack over a mare that tossed its head at the creeping cold. Holmes climbed in without a word, and I followed, clutching my scarf against the chill. We rode in silence for some time, the wheels creaking as they turned over soft, damp soil. Here and there, blurred shapes of trees emerged briefly before vanishing again into the white murk, like memories the landscape itself was struggling to recall. Holmes seemed more absorbed than usual. His eyes, though fixed on the road ahead, were narrowed in inward concentration. I knew better than to interrupt a chain of reasoning in progress, so I let the silence stand until the outline of East Dean's small parish came into view, a squat stone chapel with a tower scarcely taller than the surrounding oaks, and beside it, the ivy-choked rectory with its narrow chimney and leaded glass windows. The rector's housekeeper, a brisk and wary woman named Mrs. Pelfrey, admitted us and led us down a corridor thick with the smell of old prayer books and coal dust. We were shown into the study, where Reverend Pell rose from behind a writing desk, cluttered with correspondence. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I had word you were calling. Please, sit." Pell was a thin, intense man of perhaps 50, with ink-stained fingers and a peculiar habit of blinking rapidly whenever he paused to think. His eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles were watchful, even anxious, as though his parish might disappear if he failed to observe it closely enough. Holmes took the offered seat, but wasted no time with pleasantries. "You received Miss Lydia Garrison after her departure from Branksome Hall." "I did," said Pell. "She arrived just before noon yesterday, clearly distressed, though she tried to conceal it. I've known her since she was a child. Her mother and I were cousins." "Did she confide in you?" "In part. She mentioned her uncle's erratic behavior, the growing tension in the house, and a fear, though she would not name it. I assumed it was grief, or perhaps the strain of isolation. But then came the news of Professor Garrison's death." "And did she say anything?" Holmes continued. "Of her uncle's studies? Of a mirror?" Pell hesitated, his brow furrowing. "She did. Not directly, but enough. I believe she feared what he had found, and what it might do not just to him, but to others. She said he had been translating a manuscript he called the Arbor Orbis. Does that name mean anything to you?" Holmes stilled. "Indeed. It is a mythical text, referenced in fragments by pagan chroniclers and early Christian mystics, a supposed genealogy of sacred objects, most of them believed to be metaphors. Though, in this case, I suspect Garrison did not see them as such. I think he believed the opposite," said Pell, "that every symbol held literal power. He began to speak of thresholds, of seeing into time not metaphorically, but physically. It frightened Lydia, and truth be told, it unnerved me as well. Holmes steepled his fingers. Did he speak of a society? A secretive group perhaps using Latin nomenclature? Pell nodded slowly. He mentioned Custodes Temporis, the guardians of time, said they were ancient, older than the Roman Church, that they had preserved rites the Church itself had tried to erase. I warned him against entertaining such delusions, but he seemed convinced. He said the mirror was not merely an artifact, it was an instrument, a portal. And did he believe it was dangerous? Pell leaned forward, lowering his voice. More than dangerous. He said it could summon memories not our own. That, looking into it long enough, meant losing part of yourself. I felt a chill at that, despite the fire nearby. Holmes rose suddenly, pacing once across the floor before turning sharply. You are a man of faith, Reverend. Tell me honestly, did you believe him? There was a long pause. No, Pell said at last, but I believe he believed, and belief, when combined with desperation, can be more potent than truth. Holmes inclined his head gravely. May I see her room? Pell seemed surprised. Lydia's? Yes, I wish to examine her belongings if she permits it. The rector led us upstairs to a small guest room, sparsely furnished but tidy. A valise sat on the bed, still unopened. On the writing desk beside the window sat a notebook, half open, with the corner of a page marked. Holmes strode to it immediately, eyes scanning the lines in silence. Watson, he said quietly, have a look. I stepped beside him and read over his shoulder. He said the mirror showed not the past but possibility, that it did not record, but remember, and that it would show only to those who looked with unclouded mind. But what did he see? And why was he so afraid to write it down? Beneath it was a rough sketch, 3 interlocking circles, each containing an eye, and what appeared to be a stylized flame at their intersection. Holmes snapped the notebook shut. She knows more than she has told us, or suspects more than she dares voice. As we left the room, Holmes stopped at the stair. One final question, Reverend. Did Miss Garrison receive any visitors during her time here? No, said Pell. At least, not that I know of. Holmes turned, his voice sharper now. You're certain? Pell blinked rapidly. Well, come to think of it, I did hear carriage wheels early this morning, but when I looked from the study, I saw nothing in the lane. I assumed it was the post, though it seemed early even for them. Holmes gave a curt nod. Thank you. That may prove important. As we departed and re-entered the thick wall of fog, Holmes spoke at last in a low, urgent tone. There is someone moving between locations, Watson, someone unobserved, or nearly so. I suspect they visited both Branksome Hall and the rectory under cover of darkness. Their purpose? To recover the remaining fragments of the mirror, or silence those who possess knowledge of it. Do you believe Miss Garrison is in danger? I believe everyone within this sphere is in danger, including ourselves. We reached the carriage and mounted swiftly. Holmes issued instructions to the driver to return by a different route, a suspicion gnawing at him. It seemed that our path back might be watched. As the trap creaked back toward Branksome Hall, Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded envelope. He had taken it, without my noticing, from Miss Garrison's notebook. I mean no disrespect, he said, but it's clear she intended to send this. It's addressed to a Mr. R.C., care of the Ashmolean Museum. I believe it holds the key to understanding what Garrison feared most. He tapped the seal once, then placed the envelope in his inner pocket. If we can determine what R.C. knows if he exists, we may learn who else covets this mirror, and how far they're willing to go. The fog closed in again, and the trap's wheels churned over the rutted road. In the gloom ahead, Branksome Hall loomed faintly into view, its turrets rising like warning fingers against the pale sky. And as we neared the gates, a sudden gust scattered the mist, just enough to reveal a dark figure standing at the far edge of the grounds, motionless, half shrouded in shadow, watching the road with chilling stillness. Holmes saw it too. His hand drifted to the pocket where he'd stored the envelope. "We are no longer alone in this case, Watson, and I fear our adversary has begun to move." The trap jolted slightly as the wheels met the gravel just inside the gates of Branksome Hall. Holmes said nothing, but his gaze remained fixed on the distant tree line where the dark figure had stood only moments earlier. Now, there was nothing, just the dense fog curling like smoke around the skeletal limbs of the oaks. But the impression lingered, watching, waiting, knowing. "Did you recognize the silhouette?" I asked, lowering my voice. "No." But the stillness suggested intent, not mere wandering. They were waiting, not for us, I think, but for night. Holmes descended from the carriage before it had fully stopped and strode quickly to the main entrance. I followed, still shaken by the figure in the trees, and even more so by Holmes's reaction, measured but unmistakably urgent. Inside, Sir Alpheus met us in the vestibule, still dressed in his formal waistcoat despite the hour. His expression was troubled, and he wasted no time. "There's been a disturbance in the East Wing," he said. "The study off the library where Professor Garrison sometimes worked alone has been ransacked. Nothing stolen as far as I can tell, but the drawers are upended, books torn from the shelves." "Was anyone seen?" Holmes asked as we followed him swiftly through the corridor. "No." Merrow's men were stationed near the West Wing. No signs of forced entry. Whoever it was knew the layout. Holmes made no reply, but I could see the flickers of calculation passing through his eyes. When we reached the study, it was just as Sir Alpheus described, disordered but deliberate. Not vandalism. Search. The books had been taken down and stacked, not thrown. Desk drawers lay open, their contents examined and replaced, save one, the top left, now entirely empty. "This drawer," Holmes said quietly. "What did it contain?" Sir Alpheus stepped forward. "Only correspondence. Letters from Professor Garrison's colleagues, though I suspect some pertain to the Templewell Mirror. He kept his communications in categories." Holmes leaned closer, studying the interior. "No dust. Recently cleared." "And—" He stopped, lifting a slender length of dark thread from the seam between the drawer's edge and the frame. "Silk," he murmured, "midnight blue." This was no common housebreaker. I examined the room again, eyes sweeping the floor. Could they have found another fragment of the mirror? "Possibly," Holmes said. "Or more likely, they sought knowledge of its final resting place. Garrison had hidden at least one piece. Perhaps there are others." Sir Alpheus looked between us, visibly perturbed. "Mr. Holmes, if this intruder returns, if they mean harm to those in the house—" "They already do," Holmes said curtly, "which is why Miss Garrison must not be left unattended tonight. I trust she has been assigned a room away from the study." "She has. The Rose Room, west-facing." Holmes nodded. "Good. Watson and I will remain nearby. I suspect the next move will come under cover of darkness." We left Sir Alpheus and made our way to a chamber adjoining the West Wing corridor, modest in size but offering a clear vantage of the hallway outside Lydia's door. Holmes lit a single oil lamp and placed it carefully beside the window, its flame casting long shadows across the floorboards. "She's the key, Watson," he said softly as he sank into the armchair. "Not because she is guilty, but because she is remembered. Whatever Garrison did, whatever he uncovered, he left its weight on her shoulders. And our adversary knows this." I nodded. "Then they will try again. Tonight." "They must," Holmes replied. "Time is the essence. The pieces of the mirror are mere fragments without meaning unless joined, and the last known carrier of their location is dead. Unless, of course," he confided in his niece. Holmes fell silent, his gaze distant. I retrieved my revolver from my bag and placed it within reach on the writing desk. Outside the window, the fog remained thick, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted once, then fell quiet. Hours passed. Holmes dozed in intervals, one eye always half open, the fingers of his right hand drumming a slow rhythm on the armrest. Midnight approached. The house was still, the air heavy with that odd hush that settles only in old buildings when floorboards stop creaking and even the clocks seem to hold their breath. Then a sound, faint but unmistakable, a soft click, a turn of a doorknob. Holmes sat up instantly, every nerve alert. He motioned to me in silence, and I reached for the revolver. We moved together toward the door, easing it open to reveal the dim corridor beyond. At the far end, just outside Lydia's room, a figure knelt in shadow, tools spread across a velvet cloth. The lock was nearly undone. Holmes stepped forward swiftly, and the figure looked up but did not flee. Instead, they rose, stepping back with a grace and confidence that suggested neither panic nor fear. "Enough," Holmes said, his voice cold. "I do not yet know your name, but I know your purpose. You are too late. The mirror is broken. The vision is finished." It was a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with angular features and hair drawn back into a severe plait. Her clothes were dark and finely tailored, though not in the fashion of a domestic. Her eyes, pale, grey, and entirely unafraid, met Holmes's with curious amusement. "You presume much, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "But then, I suppose that is your gift." Holmes's posture remained taut, but he lowered his voice. "You came for her, not to harm her, but to search her room. You believe Garrison entrusted something to her, a map, perhaps, coordinates, or simply knowledge. She is unprepared for what she holds," the woman said. "As are you, if you think it can be used without consequence." They stared at one another for a long moment. I took a step forward. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Why follow this trail?" The woman's eyes flicked to me, then returned to Holmes. "I serve the order that once protected the mirror, before Garrison trespassed, before he translated what should never have been read." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then you are custodes temporis?" She smiled faintly. "No. I am what remains when they have failed." Holmes's hand moved to his lapel, withdrawing the envelope he had taken from Lydia's notebook. "This," he said, "was meant for R.C., a scholar at the Ashmolean. Is he your ally?" The woman did not move. "He was. He is gone now. Murdered in Zurich 3 days ago. For the same knowledge Garrison died protecting." There was a long silence. "And now?" Holmes asked. She looked toward Lydia's door. "Now it must be buried. All of it." Holmes's voice darkened. "You came to burn it." "Yes," she said calmly, "because others are close. Closer than you think. And if they obtain the last fragment, they will awaken something none of us can put down again." Holmes took a step back, the envelope still in his hand. "Give me a name. Who leads them?" But the woman was already retreating into the shadows. "I am not your enemy, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice distant. "But if you follow this further, you may become theirs." Then she was gone, vanishing down the staircase with such speed and silence that neither Holmes nor I made pursuit. For a long time, we stood in the corridor, watching the place where she had knelt. Holmes turned at last to Lydia's door and listened. No sound within. She had not woken. He folded the envelope again and tucked it away. "We are not at the heart of the mystery yet, Watson," he said. "But tonight, the shape of it has revealed itself." He glanced once more down the stairs. "And I fear it is older and deeper than even I had guessed." Dawn crept slowly over Branksome Hall, its pale light seeping through the veil of fog like the hesitant return of memory. It found Holmes already awake, seated at the window with the last embers of the oil lamp casting shadows against his sharp features. I had dozed in the armchair for perhaps 2 hours, but now stirred to the quiet scratch of his pen against the margin of Lydia's notebook. He was copying the interlocking circles, the stylized flame, and annotating them with symbols I did not recognize. "You didn't sleep," I said. "I slept long enough to let her go," he replied, without looking up. "You mean the intruder?" "I mean the guardian," Holmes said, "if we are to take her at her word." I rose, stretching the stiffness from my limbs. Do you? He set down the pen, fingers steepling. I believe she was telling the truth, or her version of it. She did not come to harm Lydia, only to search for what Garrison may have left behind, and I believe she would have burned the girl's possessions if it came to that. And yet, you let her leave. Holmes turned his eyes on me. Had we stopped her, Watson, we would have invited open conflict before understanding the battlefield. Knowledge before defense is a foolish posture. He stood, moving to the hearth to poke at the ashes of the lamp's wick. She claimed others are coming, that the order, or what remains of it, failed to protect the mirror, but failed against whom? Not thieves, not scholars, fanatics perhaps, or something else entirely. I glanced at the door to Lydia's room. She must be told. Soon, but not yet. At that moment, a knock came at the outer door of the hall. We both turned sharply, and moments later the housekeeper's brisk steps echoed down the corridor. A rustle of voices followed, then Sir Alpheus himself appeared, clearly agitated. "A message," he said, handing Holmes a folded note. "Delivered by courier from Lewes." I insisted he wait. Holmes unfolded the paper, eyes flicking quickly across its contents. His jaw tightened. "It's from Constable Merrow. He has discovered something, a grave, shallow, beneath the ruined chapel that borders the western edge of your estate." Sir Alpheus paled slightly. "That ground hasn't been touched in years. It's ancient." Holmes passed the paper to me. The words were few, but the meaning was potent. Body found man, recently deceased, shot execution style. No identification. Buried in haste. Ritual markings nearby. "Come at once." "Watson," Holmes said, already pulling on his coat. "Bring your bag. We may require your examination skills." The path to the ruined chapel was rough with frost, and the crunch of our boots filled the silence between trees. Holmes was quiet, unusually so, but his stride was rapid and fixed. Sir Alpheus remained behind, citing age and the morning chill. By the time we reached the moss-covered stones of the old chapel, Constable Merrow was waiting beside the broken archway. Two men behind him clearing brush. "I've kept the grave undisturbed since it was uncovered," Merrow said, greeting us with a stiff nod. One of the groundsmen noticed a patch of earth had sunk oddly overnight. When we cleared the topsoil well, he led us to a shallow depression beside what remained of the stone altar. A canvas sheet had been laid aside. Holmes knelt and began brushing earth away with gloved fingers. Within minutes, the upper body of a man emerged dressed in a dark traveling coat, face partially turned to the soil. A single bullet wound marked the back of his skull. "Executed," Holmes murmured. "Close range. Precise. No signs of struggle." I examined the body more closely. "He's been dead less than 48 hours, I said. "The soil preserved him somewhat. But what concerns me most is this." I pointed to the wrist bare, with a strip of reddened skin in the shape of a watchband. But more notably, just beneath the collarbone, a small tattoo, the same triangle and eye emblem we'd seen on the journal's charred remains. Holmes looked up at Merrow. "Was anything found on him?" "Only this," Merrow said, passing over a small, worn object wrapped in linen. Holmes unwrapped it carefully. It was a sliver of mirror, smooth on one side, with inscriptions etched so faintly into the surface they caught only the weakest light. Holmes held it up, turned it slowly, and said in a voice low with real tension, "The final fragment." Merrow blinked. "The final?" "The last piece of the Temple Well mirror," Holmes confirmed. "That makes this man either its bearer or its thief. Either way, someone wanted him silenced." "And the markings?" I asked. Merrow gestured toward the stones beside the grave. Holmes moved toward them and crouched. The moss had been cleared away to reveal symbols carved into the base of the chapel wall. 3 circles, a serpent biting its tail, and the same trinity of eyes arranged in an arc. "An invocation," Holmes murmured. "A warning, possibly both." He rose, folding the mirror fragment carefully into a leather pouch. "Mero, this man must be transported and kept under guard. Do not release word of this to anyone, not even your superior, until I advise otherwise." The constable nodded grimly. "Understood." Holmes and I began the return to the hall. He walked quickly, head lowered. "This is the fulcrum, Watson," he said. "The final piece of the mirror. Someone was close to reassembling it, and someone else was closer still to ensuring that did not happen." "You think the woman from last night killed him?" Holmes hesitated. "No, she would not have left the body to be found. This execution was hasty, unplanned, which suggests either she is not alone or she is being hunted as well." "And what of the fragment?" He patted the pouch. "We keep it hidden for now, but not still. We shall send it out, Watson, under false name and secure courier, to Oxford. Let them preserve it until this is resolved." When we arrived at Branksome Hall, the fog had begun to thin, and pale sun illuminated the upper windows. Inside, Lydia Garrison waited for us in the drawing room. She stood as we entered, her eyes going to Holmes immediately. "You found something." He did not deny it. "Your uncle's fears were justified," Holmes said gently, "and more than that, shared. Others knew of the mirror, and one of them now lies buried behind the chapel wall." She said nothing for a moment, then asked, "Was it her? The woman?" "No," Holmes replied. "This man was killed by another, perhaps one who seeks the mirror not to bury it but to use it." He handed her the folded envelope, the one she had meant to send to RC. "He is dead," Holmes said softly. "But your instincts were correct. He may have been able to help, and his death proves someone else is tracing your steps." She looked down at the envelope, then closed her eyes. "What happens now?" Holmes's face was solemn. "Now we force their hand. Tonight we shall perform a reconstruction of the events leading to your uncle's death. In the West Study, same hour, same conditions." Her breath caught. "To what end?" "To awaken the memory," Holmes said, "and to catch the one who has tried to erase it." As she nodded, pale and resolute, Holmes turned to me. "Send the fragment by telegraph courier, Watson. Name of Sebastian Green, sent to the care of Professor Willoughby at Oxford's Department of Antiquities. Mark it unrelated. Mark it dull. We'll draw their eyes here while the mirror slips from their reach." He faced the staircase, voice low. "And tonight, Watson, we look through the window that remembers, and hope we're not the ones it chooses to show next." The rest of the day passed beneath a sky that refused to clear, the sun remaining a pale disk behind drifting vapors. Branksome Hall became quieter, more watchful. Holmes had given orders with precision. Mero's constables were to maintain visible patrols around the grounds, ensuring any watching eyes were made to feel pressure. The servants were to be kept inside after dusk, and no mention of the mirror, the body, or the woman was to reach the village. By early evening, Holmes had arranged the West Study exactly as it had appeared the night Professor Garrison died. The desk had been restored to its prior disorder, the same folio laid open to the passage on the Green Man. The hearth had been cleaned and reset, ready to be lit. Even the inkstand, scorched at the edges, was placed where it had been found in the constable's photographs. "Reconstruction," Holmes said, as he inspected the window once again, "is not merely an exercise in mimicry. It is a tool of revelation. That which eluded us the first time may now choose to appear. Or," I said quietly, "we may invite attention of a kind we are not prepared for." Holmes gave a faint, grim smile. "We are never prepared for truth, Watson. Only positioned." As the clock struck 2, the house fell into deliberate silence. Lydia remained in her chamber, under the guard of a constable. I sat in a chair in the corridor beyond the West Study's door, revolver at hand. Holmes was inside alone. He had lit the fire and taken Garrison's chair. For nearly 20 minutes he sat in silence, unmoving, his eyes fixed upon the ancient, rippled glass of the sealed window. Then, just past 2:40, he spoke. "Watson," he said softly, not turning. "Come in." I entered, the hinges creaking faintly as I shut the door behind me. The fire hissed quietly on the hearth. Holmes remained seated, head tilted very slightly toward the glass. "Observe," he whispered. I moved cautiously toward him and looked where he did into the window. At first, all I saw was what I expected. The flicker of firelight behind us, warped and stretched by the uneven surface of the ancient pane. The iron bars cast faint shadows, and the glass shimmered faintly with the heat, rising from the hearth. Then something changed. A flicker not of light, but of presence. A brief dimming along the edges. And in the depths of the window, something moved. It was not our reflection. It was the room, yes, but subtly different. The fire burned lower. The desk bore more papers. And standing at it, his back turned to us, was a man. Garrison. He was flipping through the folio, just as Sir Alpheus had described. I froze, unable to speak. Holmes did not move. Behind Garrison, another figure materialized. This one indistinct, cloaked in shadow. It moved without sound or hesitation, lifting a small, heavy object from the shelf. Then the blow came swift and brutal. Garrison crumpled. The fire dimmed to nothing. The image vanished. We stood in stunned silence for a long moment. My heart pounded violently in my chest. Holmes exhaled slowly and leaned forward, eyes still fixed on the glass. "It was never a reflection," he murmured. "It was a recording, imprinted not on film, but on the memory of the glass itself, like wax pressed by heat, then sealed." I could find no words. Holmes rose and turned to me, his face more drawn than I'd seen it in months. "The killer," he said, "did not anticipate the glass. He believed the room sealed, the crime unwitnessed. But in his obsession with the mirror, Garrison created something else, a medium that preserved not just objects, but moments." "You mean the glass remembers?" Holmes nodded once. "It is not supernatural. It is sensory. It bends more than light, it bends impression. Resonant material, touched by intention and ritual, becomes more than inert surface. It becomes witness." He moved to the hearth, stoking the fire higher, his mind now racing. But there was something else. The killer, he was familiar. I could not see his face clearly, but his height, his posture. A knock sounded at the main door, urgent. Then again. Holmes turned. I followed him quickly to the corridor, and down the stairs, where Merrow was already answering. A tall man, in a grey travelling coat, stood in the entryway, dripping from the mist. His face was narrow, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. He held a sealed envelope in one hand. "I was told to deliver this to Mr. Holmes," he said, breathless. "From Oxford. Professor Willoughby." Holmes took the letter, opened it swiftly, and read. As he did, his face shifted first to confusion, then to alarm. "Watson, come, now." We retreated to the study beside the hall. Holmes laid the letter on the table and passed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, the courier who brought the parcel was not your man. Sebastian Green was found bound and unconscious this morning in an Oxford inn. The package had been taken. I fear you have been deceived. We have dispatched a search, but the mirror fragment is gone. I felt the blood drain from my face." "We were watched," Holmes said, voice cold. "Not just at the rectory or here, but at the telegraph office. They knew we would send the fragment, and they intercepted it." I stood, too stunned to speak. Holmes was already pacing, his energy sharpening. "That woman, the Guardian, she was right. We have drawn attention. And now the last piece is in the hands of someone who believes they can use it." "Use it how?" I managed. "To reopen the mirror. To see not just the past, but to alter it. To choose what moment lives or dies." A constable entered then, breathless. "Sir, a rider was seen just now, galloping from the woods. East Road, toward the cliffs. Holmes looked at me, fire igniting behind his eyes. They've finished their work here. Now they go to the altar. I stared at him. You mean the chapel? No longer a ruin, Watson. Not to them. To them it is a gate. Without further word, he turned and bolted toward the front steps. I followed, revolver in hand. Outside, the fog had thinned just enough to show hoofprints in the softened earth. Holmes mounted the waiting horse Merrow had secured earlier for the patrols and took off into the mist. I followed, heart hammering as the wind cut into my coat. The trees blurred by spectral in the early light. As we reached the edge of the chapel clearing, Holmes pulled up sharply. The stones were glowing faintly. Not with light, but with reflection. The glass, I realized. The shards they'd been laid out in a circle on the ground, mirroring the pattern from Garrison's notebook, and at its center a man knelt, arms outstretched, chanting softly in a tongue that set the hair on my neck upright. Holmes dismounted and advanced. You've already failed, he called. The moment you seek to reclaim is dead. Just as you will be if you finish that rite. The man looked up. His face was unfamiliar to me, but Holmes stopped cold. You, he said, astonished, the assistant curator. From the British Museum. The man smiled, thin and terrible. Not assistant, not anymore. Then he struck the ground with the hilt of an iron rod, and the mirror shards flared, and the air around us bent. Holmes turned to me with only 2 words. Break it. And then the world tilted toward something I could not name. I lunged forward without hesitation, driven not by understanding but by instinct. Holmes had shouted the word with a clarity that demanded no explanation. Break it. The circle of glass shards shimmered like a surface of disturbed water, and the chanting from the kneeling man was rising, his voice guttural, rhythmic, ancient. The iron rod he held pulsed faintly, as though channeling some force beneath the very earth. The fragments of the temple well mirror, once dull and lifeless in our hands, now pulsed in unison with the man's voice. Light danced between them, pale blue and silvery gold, forming lines, then arcs, then a complete circle that seemed to spin gently in place. I raised my boot and brought it down upon the nearest shard with all the force I could muster. It resisted. The glass did not shatter as glass should it gave, then sang out with a tone, like a struck crystal bowl. I recoiled, shaken, my leg jarred by the blow. Holmes reached the circle then, tearing his gaze away from the now whipping wind that had begun to spiral outward from the ritual site. The iron rod, Watson. He's using it to anchor the ritual. That's the key strike, that. I turned to the kneeling man, no longer kneeling, but rising now, his eyes fixed on Holmes with something between scorn and revelation. You do not understand, he said, his voice layered with a sound not entirely his own. This is not desecration. This is remembrance. This is correction. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stepped swiftly inside the circle, his boots crunching into frost, but he faltered, only slightly, as the air within it grew heavier, as though passing through some invisible threshold. Still, he pressed forward. The man swung the iron rod toward Holmes as if to ward him off, but Holmes ducked low, grabbed a fallen stone from the chapel ruin, and brought it up hard beneath the man's outstretched arm. There was a crack, bone or metal, I could not say, but the rod clattered to the ground, rolling toward me. Without thought, I seized it. It burned cold in my hand. Not metaphorically, it was freezing. My fingers numbed instantly, and for a moment my vision clouded as images flickered across my sight. Faces I did not know, wars not yet fought, a child crying beside a river of blood. I dropped it with a cry, and the vision passed. Holmes had taken advantage of the moment to sweep his arm across the circle, scattering the shards outward. They struck the soil with soft thuds, and the light connecting them snapped. The man screamed, not in pain, but in despair, and collapsed to his knees. All at once, the wind ceased, the unnatural stillness shattered by the sound of shattering glass. One of the larger fragments had cracked down the center. Then came silence, cold, Absolute. The clearing was still. No glow, no resonance. Just breath hours and the sound of a single nightbird taking flight. Holmes turned to the man who now crouched in the dirt, trembling, his hands cradling nothing. "You sought to rewrite time," Holmes said, his voice colder than I had ever heard it. "But you forgot the cardinal truth. Memory is not obedient. It resists manipulation. And those who live in the past are already ghosts." The man looked up at him through bloodshot eyes. "He promised," he whispered. "He promised I could undo it. My brother, he died in the trenches. I saw him fall. He said I could call it back. Change the hour. One moment. That's all I wanted." Holmes didn't speak at once. He simply stood there, wind tugging at his coat, eyes hard. "There is no clean edit in time," he said at last. "Only scars that deepen." I stepped forward. "Who is he?" The man blinked slowly. "The one who gave me the rod, the map, the texts. He never told me his name, only that he was once part of the order. A fragment," he said, "just like the mirror." Holmes crouched. "And where is he now?" The man shook his head. "Gone. Vanished weeks ago. Left me with instructions, but the ritual there were parts I didn't understand. He said the mirror would complete them for me." Holmes stood, and so it nearly did. Behind us, footsteps approached. Constable Merrow, along with 2 of his men, emerged from the mists with rifles drawn. Holmes gestured to the man on the ground. "Take him. No resistance left in him now. Put him under guard and take statements, but keep him isolated. I believe the full list of what he's seen may stretch beyond our jurisdiction." Merrow nodded grimly, motioning for the arrest. As they led the man away, Holmes and I remained in the clearing. The shards of the mirror lay scattered in the frost, still faintly glowing where the moonlight touched them. Holmes began to gather them carefully into a cloth satchel, wrapping each with methodical precision. "These will go to the Ashmolean after all," he said, "but not by courier. I shall hand-deliver them. The fewer hands involved from here forward, the better." "What about the rod?" I asked, nodding toward it, still lying cold and inert on the ground. Holmes retrieved it with a cloth, never touching it directly, and placed it in a second satchel. "We've broken the circle, but the instrument remains dangerous. It acts as a key, but only to a door we should never open again." We returned to Branksome Hall by dawnlight. The mist was finally lifting, its retreat slow and deliberate, like a secret it no longer needed to keep. Lydia met us at the door, having refused to sleep. "You stopped it?" she asked. Holmes inclined his head. "The man who killed your uncle sought not to silence him, but to use him. Professor Garrison was a thinker, not a practitioner. He found the formula. Others applied it." She clutched her shawl tighter. "And the mirror?" "Shattered," Holmes said, "but not harmless. It will be kept under strict protection." She breathed out and nodded slowly. "Then it's over." Holmes's face did not soften. "For now." Later that morning, we sat together in the west study once more. Holmes stared again at the window, now merely glass and lead, its secrets spent. "Do you know what he saw?" I asked. "Garrison." When he looked into it, Holmes's eyes remained on the sill. "I believe," he said slowly, "he saw a moment he had buried, something long gone, perhaps something he wished to undo, but he resisted the temptation. That was his strength and his downfall." I said nothing. Holmes stood and moved to the fire, warming his long fingers. "I shall leave tomorrow for Oxford," he said. "These fragments are too volatile to remain in the open, but you, Watson, you may remain. Miss Garrison may still need an ally, and should anything stir again in the stone of this house, I trust you will call me. I always do." He gave a rare, quiet smile. "Then let the past remain where it belongs," but never repeated. Holmes departed Branksome Hall before sunrise, the shards of the Templewell mirror and the iron rod wrapped in his satchels and secured by hand. I stood with Lydia at the portico, as the carriage wheels faded down the frost-lined road, the mist retreating in thin rivulets behind it. He had left with few words but a purposeful glance, one I had seen before when a case had closed, but not settled. For myself, I remained as Holmes requested. It was not only for Miss Garrison's protection, though that reason alone would have sufficed. I sensed, as did Holmes, that some residual presence lingered in the house, not supernatural, but psychological. Branksome Hall had borne witness to ancient intentions, and though the mirror had been broken and the ritual undone, the minds it touched were not so easily unshaped. Lydia and I spoke little that day. She walked the halls as though reacquainting herself with a childhood friend long since altered. The servants moved cautiously, glancing at windows, the corners of rooms, as if some ripple in the house might yet reveal a forgotten vision. I did my best to be visible but unobtrusive Holmes's parting counsel. By evening, I found myself once again in the west study. The fire was low, the ash faintly glowing. The window no longer shimmered. It had reverted to ordinary glass, or so it seemed. I stood before it a long time, waiting, half in doubt, half in dread, but no images came. I sat in Garrison's chair, now cleared of his work, and reached instinctively for the folio he had studied that final night. It had been replaced on the shelf, but I retrieved it, opening to the page he'd left exposed. The Green Man. The figure stared back at me through medieval ink, leaves emerging from his mouth, eyes wide, almost mocking. Beside the page, I now noticed something that had escaped my attention before, a slip of parchment, aged and brittle, inserted at a deliberate angle, perhaps overlooked by Holmes in his earlier haste. I slid it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was Garrison's, uneven, but precise. A journal entry, hastily scrawled. The mirror responds to memory not as a reflection, but as a resonance. It shows what the mind burns brightest. But what if one's brightest flame is not past, but potential? I fear the ritual is incomplete. Not a loop, but a lever. Alpheus suspects, but I cannot tell him. The Watchers were not disbanded. They scattered, and someone has found them. Tonight I will test the threshold one final time. If I am wrong, then I will have shown only what was. If I am right, God forgive me, I may have opened the door for what will be. I set the page down, unease prickling at the back of my neck. Holmes had said it best. Garrison had not sought to change time, but he had feared someone else might. The mirror had not simply recalled the past, it had recorded it, amplified it, echoed it into the minds of those willing to see beyond what should be seen. As I sat in thought, a knock came at the study door. I rose, startled, and opened it to find Lydia standing there in her evening cloak, her hair pulled back, her expression composed but pale. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "May I?" I stepped aside, and she entered slowly, pausing as her eyes fell upon the window. "I dreamt of it," she said after a moment. "But it wasn't the past I saw. It was me, standing in this room, watching myself." I studied her carefully. "Did it frighten you?" She turned to me. "No. It confused me. I wasn't doing anything. Just waiting. For someone. For something." We sat together by the fire, silence falling between us. Then, quietly, she said, "You know, he tried to burn the journal." I looked at her sharply. "My uncle," she explained. "The one you found in pieces, he tried to destroy it the night before he died. But he changed his mind. I think he knew someone would come for it, that maybe it would survive him." "Do you think he wanted someone to finish his work?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I think he wanted someone to understand it, to realize why it had to end." The flames in the hearth crackled softly. I leaned forward, feeling the weight of Garrison's last thoughts in my coat pocket. "You said you saw yourself waiting, not watching." She nodded. "And if someone else looked into the glass now?" I asked, slowly. "If it were whole again?" Her eyes found mine, They would see me, still waiting. We said no more that night. Eventually, she retired. I remained in the study, pacing slowly as the fire died and the shadows returned. Holmes wired me the next day from Oxford. The mirror fragments had been delivered into Professor Willoughby's safekeeping, and the rod wrapped in lead foil and sealed within a locked vault was to be subjected to spectrographic and metallurgic analysis under supervision. Holmes noted, in his typical precise hand, that none of the scholars could explain the faint magnetic pulse still emanating from the fragments, nor could they decipher several of the inscriptions that had only become visible under laboratory ultraviolet light. But the final lines of his telegram struck me most deeply. "Do not mistake broken glass for resolution, Watson. The past cannot be undone, but it can, in the hands of the devoted, be misremembered. Truth, therefore, must be guarded like fire in winter. We return soon. Hold fast. S.H." I folded the wire and tucked it into my notebook. Outside, Branksome Hall stood beneath a sky of slow-moving clouds. Lydia walked the gardens below with deliberate slowness, a journal in her hand. The window in the west, study no longer, shimmered, no longer whispered its illusions. But sometimes when the light fell just so across its ancient bars, I fancied I could see, not a vision, but a presence behind the glass, watching, waiting, and I wondered, not without unease, whether the glass had ever needed the mirror at all. The days that followed passed with deceptive calm. I remained at Branksome Hall at Holmes's request, maintaining an outward air of normalcy while quietly observing Lydia, the staff, and the house itself. Holmes, meanwhile, telegraphed sparingly from Oxford, always brief, always exact, his words forming a thread of watchfulness even across the miles. The mirror fragments remained secure, the rod sealed and untouched. Yet I sensed, and Holmes confirmed, that the matter had not yet concluded. It was on the third night after Holmes's departure that the silence broke. I had taken to sleeping lightly, with my revolver within reach and my door unlatched. Though I had no reason to expect danger, instinct honed from years beside Holmes urged caution. And so when a soft creak echoed through the hall just past 2 in the morning, I rose at once, coat drawn on hastily over my nightshirt. I moved down the corridor, every board seeming to announce my step. The moonlight filtering through the high windows was pale and cold. The noise, I now discerned, had come not from the west study nor from Lydia's chambers, but from the lower level, perhaps the eastern corridor near the servants' passage. I descended the stair quietly, careful not to betray my presence. Near the foot of the main stair, I saw it. A figure cloaked in a dark traveling coat moving through the shadows with determined care. He carried a lantern shrouded by cloth, its light dim but enough to guide his steps. He walked like a man who knew the house intimately. I followed at a careful distance, heart steady, breath silent. He turned sharply down a stone passage that led beneath the east wing, an old wine storage, a corridor that, to my knowledge, had not been used in years. I waited until he passed from sight, then moved quickly to the door. It stood open. Beyond it, cool stone and the faint smell of mildew rose to greet me. I descended the short stair and came to a low hallway lit only by the faint spill of the man's hidden lantern. He had stopped just ahead before a wall I had thought solid. Now, however, I saw his hand press firmly against a notch in the masonry. There was a soft click, and a panel gave way. A hidden door. I froze. The man turned slightly, listening. Then, without a word, he stepped through the opening and disappeared. I hesitated no longer. With revolver in hand and lantern lit low, I passed through the concealed door and found myself in a space older than any room above. The air was cooler, stiller. The floor beneath me was earth, and the ceiling supported by ancient beams blackened with age. At the far end, the man now stood beside what appeared to be a stone plinth. I raised the lantern, my voice sharp and clear. "Stay where you are." He turned, and to my astonishment, it was not a stranger but Sir Alpheus Branksome. He regarded me with a quiet, almost mournful expression, as though I had merely interrupted a long-delayed confession. "You shouldn't be down here, Doctor," he said softly. I kept the revolver steady. "And yet here you are, Sir Alpheus, sneaking through secret corridors in your own house. Explain." He sighed. "I built this chamber myself, years ago, or rather I uncovered it. The original structure predates the hall, a fragment of the monastic foundation. I preserved it. For what purpose?" He looked down at the plinth, upon which rested a stone bowl and several worn texts. "I was once part of the order," he said, "long ago. Before I turned away from its aims, I stepped closer, cautious. You never mentioned this. Not to Holmes. Not to your niece. I thought it behind me," he said. "I swore never to touch that knowledge again. But when Eli came, when he brought the mirror fragment, I felt it stirring. He knew more than he should. Much of it half correct, but still dangerous. And yet you allowed him to continue." "I tried to guide him without guiding him," Sir Alpheus replied. "A fool's hope. He was too clever, too determined. He believed he could record time not to change it, but to hold it still, that the past could be observed like a specimen on a slide. And did you kill him?" I asked quietly. He looked up sharply. "No. I swear it on every sacred thing. That was not me. But I believe my silence allowed it to happen." I lowered my revolver slightly. The man who performed the ritual he mentioned being guided, fed knowledge. Sir Alpheus nodded. There were fragments of the order that splintered off after its dissolution. Rogue agents. I suspected one had contacted Eli, but he never admitted it. By the time I realized the extent of what was being prepared, the mirror had already begun to respond. "You saw the vision," I said. "I did. That night, in the window. We stood together in the dim space, silence stretching. 'You must tell Holmes,' I said. 'Everything.' 'I will,' he replied. 'But there is something else you must see.' He turned to the wall beside the plinth and pressed another notch. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing a single, unbroken piece of the mirror oval in shape, the size of a hand. My breath caught. "But I thought, I kept one," he said. "When Eli first arrived, before he assembled the rest, I feared what he might do and thought to protect him from the whole. But I was wrong. Fragmented or whole, the mirror speaks, especially to those who listen." I stared at the shard. Even in the lantern's dim light, it shimmered faintly. "We need to send this to Holmes," I said at last. He shook his head. "Not yet. Holmes is in Oxford. If he moves now, they may follow. The ones who hunted the ritualist are not done. They will look for the source. And if they learn I still possess this, they'll come." He nodded once. "Then we move it. At once," I said. We sealed the drawer again. Sir Alpheus insisted on wrapping the shard in thick black cloth, then into a leather pouch secured in a locked valise. I took it into my care. As we ascended the hidden stair once more, the first silver of dawn crept through the upper windows. Lydia stood waiting in the corridor above. She looked not surprised but resolved. "You heard?" I asked. "I've always known there were things my uncle didn't tell me," she said. "Now I know why." Sir Alpheus placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry. You deserved the truth." "We all did," she replied. We returned to the drawing room together, and over the fire, I penned a telegram to Holmes. "Alpheus was once order. A shard remains. We are watched. Shall transport with care. Await instructions. J.W." When the message was dispatched, I turned to Sir Alpheus. "What now?" He looked out the frost-rimmed window. "Now," he said, "we see if truth, once broken, can be safeguarded, or whether it insists on being seen." Holmes arrived before sunset. I had just returned from the telegraph office when the sound of wheels crunching over frost-laced gravel reached my ears. I crossed the front hall swiftly and opened the door to find Holmes stepping from a dark cab. His collar turned high, his eyes sharp and unreadable. He said nothing at first, only met my gaze, as if weighing what had changed since he had left. I stepped aside to let him in. "The mirror," he said, without preamble, once we reached the drawing room. "You have it." I nodded and led him to the sideboard where the leather valise sat beneath a folded rug. Holmes took it, set it upon the table, and undid the buckles. He unwrapped the mirror fragment carefully, his movements unusually slow, almost reverent. When the cloth fell away, the shard lay nestled in his palm, cool, dark, deceptively inert. Holmes studied it under the lamplight. As the firelight caught its edge, a shimmer moved just beneath its surface, like a reflection not quite in sync with the room around us. "This is older than the others," he murmured. "How can you tell? The composition? The wear?" This fragment was not broken recently. It was already fractured, perhaps centuries ago. "It was never part of the mirror Professor Garrison assembled. It's a relic of the original object." Lydia entered the room, pausing when she saw Holmes. She bowed her head in quiet greeting. "You returned quickly," she said. Holmes did not look away from the shard, because Watson's telegram suggested that this case was not yet over. He glanced up then, fixing her with a look both keen and gentle. "And because the past, Miss Garrison, has a curious way of not remaining buried when there are still those left to remember it." She nodded once and moved to the hearth. Holmes returned the fragment to the cloth and placed the valise beside his chair. "Sir Alpheus, in the library," I said. "He's preparing a statement for the Crown, at your recommendation." "He'll need it," Holmes said. "I received word this morning. The body of another man was found outside Oxford. Throat cut. No identification. Another rogue agent?" I asked. "Likely," Holmes said. "The Ministry has begun to take notice, though they will not admit it openly. The mirror was not merely of antiquarian interest. It attracted too many eyes. Some with an interest in history, others with an interest in control." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "But the question that now remains, Watson, is why Sir Alpheus kept this particular shard." "He said it was out of fear," I replied. "That Garrison was delving too deeply, that he believed withholding one piece might slow the ritual, perhaps break its rhythm." Holmes nodded slowly. "A sensible decision, if one intended only to delay, but not if he wished to prevent it entirely." He stood and walked to the window, looking out into the dusk. The trees beyond the lawn stood stark and silent, their black branches netting the pale sky. "I have been thinking," Holmes said, "about the ritualist, the man who tried to use the mirror, about his belief that he could correct the past, that someone had promised him it could be done." He turned back to face us. "That promise came from someone else, a voice behind the mirror, not before it. Someone who knew the history, knew the Order's fragments, and fed pieces to desperate men hoping for redemption." Lydia spoke for the first time in some minutes. "Do you mean someone within the Order still operates?" Holmes gave her a long, measured look. "I believe someone co-opted its remains. A splinter cell, perhaps, or an individual who saw in the Order's secrecy an opportunity. The mirror's legend is too dangerous to leave untended." A knock interrupted us. Merrow entered, removing his cap. "Apologies, Mr. Holmes. Telegram for you. Marked urgent." Holmes took the slip and read it silently. Then, with unsettling calm, he folded it and handed it to me. "Fragment recovered from Zurich burned in transit. Courier deceased. Explosion ruled accidental. Suspected interference. No further transport advised. Professor Willoughby." I stared at the message, the implications cold in my gut. "They're destroying the pieces," I said quietly. "No," Holmes said. "They're cleansing them, ensuring no residue remains, and silencing those who've come too close." Lydia stepped closer to the fire. "Then what happens now?" Holmes picked up the valise. "We hide this piece where even memory cannot reach it." He turned to Merrow. "I need a carriage to the coast. Within the hour." and a boat, arranged before dawn. No records, no names, paid in coin. Merrow blinked but nodded. "Aye, sir." Holmes looked to me. "You'll remain here, Watson. I'll send word once the fragment is safely beyond reach." I wanted to object to demand I accompany him, but something in his tone forestalled protest. This was a final step, a severing blow to close the case. As Holmes made his final preparations, I stood again in the west study. The window before me remained still, clear, but I found no comfort in its silence. I had seen what it could show. I had felt its memory press against mine like a cold breath on the nape of my neck. I heard Holmes behind me. "Whatever this was," I said, not turning, "it's older than any of us realized." "It always is," Holmes said. "History is not a book, Watson. It is a mirror, and like all mirrors, it can be cracked." He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You've done well." Then he was gone. I watched from the upper window as his carriage vanished into the dark, toward the coast, toward some secret edge of England where memory might fail and the past, at last, be laid to rest. But long after the sound of hooves had faded, I remained at the window. And behind me, in the study's long glass, something small and silent shifted so faintly I could never be sure it was not my own reflection. Remembering. The weeks that followed passed in gradual thaw. Branksome Hall, once weighed down by fog and shadows, began to breathe again. The servants resumed their routines, the study doors stayed open, and the west corridor, long avoided, was walked without the hush of reverence or fear. Yet the sense that something profound had occurred, that the house itself remembered, lingered in the corners, like a scent that never quite faded. Holmes remained away longer than expected. His telegrams were brief, cautious. Delivery complete. No incident. Then later. Remnants disposed with certainty. Not traceable. Recovered papers suggest no immediate threat remains. And finally, return unnecessary. Case concluded. Will explain in person. I remained at Branksome for Lydia's sake as much as my own. We spoke often not of the mirror or the dead, but of the living, of her uncle's conflicted legacy, of memory and how easily it could be misused. Even when intentions began in sorrow, she did not ask if I believed the mirror truly showed time, or whether it had merely mirrored madness. I think, like Holmes, she knew both were possible and neither safe. Then, one evening in late March, as the sun set in warm gold over the South Downs, Holmes returned. He arrived without ceremony, as was his way, descending from a hired trap with dust on his boots and wind in his coat. I met him at the gate. His face, as ever, revealed little, but there was a faint contentment in his eyes I had seen only at the end of the most vexing puzzles. "Well," I said, extending a hand, "have we sealed the past?" Holmes shook my hand and allowed the faintest smile. "Sealed, Watson, or, at the very least, denied oxygen." That evening we sat once more in the west study, as the fire danced low and the house stood quiet. "You were right," I said, "about the rogue scholar, about the mirror being misused." Holmes nodded. Garrison did not fully understand what he carried, nor did the others. The mirror was never meant for visions. It was a warning. "A warning?" He leaned forward, tapping his fingers softly together. The Temple Well mirror, in its earliest form, was not for revelation. It was for containment, a means of locking memory into material. Sacred memory, the kind of knowledge that could fracture nations, or faith. But why scatter it? To prevent its misuse, Holmes replied. The Order believed that even memory, raw, true memory, could destroy. It recorded events not as people remembered them, but as they were, without the filter of mercy. To see oneself in such clarity, it unravels the self. I sat back, the idea chilling. So those who sought it wanted power over truth, Holmes said. They believed that by reassembling the mirror, they could rewrite not just perception, but outcome. But the mirror doesn't obey will. It reflects what the world was, not what one wishes, and that dissonance breaks the mind. And what of the woman, the guardian? She vanished, Holmes said. But her trail led me to an archive in Prague. There were fragments, there burned pages, notes, a ledger of names. The order lives still, in threads. Most have turned inward. Some, like the man who sought your life, believe the past can still be reshaped. They will try again, but the mirror, Watson, as it once was, no longer exists. He stood and approached the window. The glass no longer shimmered. Only the faint reflection of the room behind him moved in its face. I had it submerged, he said. The final shard, weighted and lowered into a sealed chamber beneath the coastal cliffs at Tiragena. A crypt built by monastic hands. It will not be found. And the rod? Destroyed, Holmes said. Its alloy was not of any known metal, possibly ceremonial, but heat and salt rendered it to slag. I rose and joined him at the glass. Then it's over. For now, Holmes replied, but the lesson remains. He turned to me, and for once there was no triumph in his voice, only gravity. Truth must be known, Watson, but only when it can be borne. The mirror was not evil. It was merely too honest. We stood in silence a moment longer. Then I saw Holmes glance again at the window. Do you know what I saw? That first night? He asked. I shook my head. Myself, he said simply. Not as I am, but as I might have been. Without the work, without the discipline, I was seated in that chair. Alone. A violin in hand. No Watson. No cases. Just silence. He turned away from the window and retrieved his coat. Which is why, he added, voice quiet, I broke the circle, not just to stop the ritual, but to stop him, the man I might have become. And with that, we stepped into the hallway, where Lydia waited by the staircase. She smiled at Holmes, and he returned it with rare sincerity. You've been brave, he told her. She looked down. And you've been kind, in a way that frightens me more than the mirror ever did. Holmes chuckled softly. Then I've succeeded. As we left Branksome Hall behind, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The window caught the last of the light. It reflected nothing but sky. Back at Baker Street weeks later, the case notes lay in my journal untouched for days. I could not bring myself to write them. Not at first. For how does one document a case that hinged not upon deduction, but memory? Not upon crime, but reflection. But in time, I wrote it all down, every detail, every choice, every glimmer of the impossible made visible. And at the final page, I added one quiet line, written in my own hand alone. The past is not to be changed, nor controlled, nor returned to. Only understood. And sometimes resisted. Dr. John H. Watson, End.